Hi, my name is Ben Evetts. I'm the Partnership Manager for Mining and Resources at Tasman Environmental Markets. I believe deeply in nature's intrinsic right to exist, and I've dedicated the last 10 years of my career to supporting Indigenous people's efforts to protect biodiversity and the precious landscapes that we have left. You'd think this would typically place me firmly against mining and resource extraction, but it doesn't. I acknowledge that the ethics of mining are complex. However, when it comes to climate change, mining has a great potential to end up on the right side of history. The world's moving from a fuel-based energy system to a minerals-based energy system. The quantity of minerals we need is staggering. It now takes 50% more minerals to produce 1 unit of energy than it did 10 years ago, and this is at only 30% global renewable energy adoption. We can't get these minerals from a circular economy and recycling at a rate that would transition us fast enough to arrest a climate disaster. But there's a profound shift underway. Unlike the reliance on combustible fuels to power the world's energy needs, we're seeing that once a mineral is extracted and converted to a solar panel, windmill or battery, it remains in existence for perpetuity and can be further recycled and repurposed. The sheer scale of such renewable projects have the potential to drive economies of scale in recycling and circular economy design that can only be dreamed of today. The scale of minerals we need to transition to a net zero economy is profound. To help illustrate this, it's worth examining the world's energy system. We know we require approximately 5,000 gigawatts of dispatchable power to keep the global population and economy powered up at any given point in time. And only 30% of this currently comes from renewables. If we'd achieve net zero, then we need to begin by replacing a staggering 3,500 gigawatts of dispatchable grid transmitted electricity currently being produced by fossil fuels. This does not factor in population growth, which could see the need for energy double by 2050 as we reach 10 billion people, and as poorer nations become more economically developed and reliant on higher loads of reliable energy. But what does this actually mean? 1 gigawatt, or a billion watts, requires about 3 million photovoltaic panels, the panels that convert thermal energy into electricity, which is about enough to power a mid-sized city. Powering the world using solar with today's photovoltaic technology would require the production and installation of approximately 15 billion solar panels. This sounds like a lot. So to put things into perspective, let's consider the initiative in the Northern Territory of Australia. One of the largest solar projects, if not the largest solar project, Sun Cable, is set to cover 12,000 hectares of solar panels at approximately 13 billion Australian dollars. Whilst there's some big questions around the viability of the project, the scale is visionary and it's useful for thought experiment. Consider if the project gets up and running, it could power up to 15% of Singapore's energy needs through a 4,200 kilometre undersea cable. Put into global perspective, however, the project will only produce about 3.3 gigawatts of dispatchable energy, or 0.06% of the world's energy requirements, or 0.9% of total fossil fuels in our energy system that need to be replaced with clean energy. Crudely put, we need about 1,000 sun cable projects to get the world's current grid-based energy needs to zero emissions. That's a cool 30 trillion Australian dollars, or 20% of global GDP, if they all cost as much as sun cable, which they won't. But again, this is just the start, as the above calculations only account for electricity in our grid system that currently comes from fossil fuels. If we look to electrify iron smelting, aluminium production and other heavy industries, which we must, then we need to go much further, as they rely on burning of cheap fossil fuels that can easily be transported from a coal mine in Queensland to an iron smelter in China. If we electrify heavy industry, then the amount of renewable energy we need doubles to approximately 7,000 gigawatts of dispatchable energy, which is about 2,100 new sun cable projects. Factor in population growth, and we may need to double these figures again by 2050. The scale of minerals needed for mega renewable projects such as Sun Cable and the Western Green Energy Hub, as well as the upgraded grid infrastructure needed to transport the energy across the region, position Australia's mining industry as one of the primary producers of a decarbonised world. So much so that it could see a monumental shift in Australia's geopolitical standing. The global energy system is currently dominated by oil producing countries such as USA, Russia and Saudi Arabia. The clean energy revolution, driven in a large part by lithium, copper, cobalt and nickel, are found in abundance in Australia. In addition to this, some think that the clean energy revolution could set Australia up for one of the largest industrial and economic opportunities of our recent history. Ross Garnaut, one of Australia's most prophetic economists, makes a powerful case in his book The Superpower and his new book The Superpower Transformation, positioning Australia with the potential of becoming a global economic leader using scale to reduce cost of renewable energy, such that it once again becomes viable to produce steel, aluminium and other energy-embedded products in Australia, all whilst attracting higher green premiums for these products as a result of them being carbon neutral. We used to be able to easily transport fossil fuels all over the world, but you can't ship sunlight or wind. It must be transported as electricity through copper cables. There's a misconception that countries like Australia and the US have a unified national grid network that are ready and waiting to freely transport renewable energy from where it's produced to where it's needed. The reality is a bit messier, as infrastructure is based on where the existing fossil fuel power plants exist, not where the renewable farms exist. Billions of dollars worth of copper is going to be required for high voltage transmission lines to connect new renewable projects to the end users. By 2040, the International Energy Agency expects demand for lithium to grow by more than 40 times its current levels if the world's going to meet its Paris agreements. This has sparked claims of a new lithium rush in Australia, and Australia positions itself to be the world's go-to supplier. 90% of demand is expected to come from batteries and EVs. The grim news is that there's only about 70 years worth of lithium left at forecasted demand until the identified global reserves are depleted. This could be enough time, however, to innovate our way to the next big energy solution. Despite its integral role as a primary producer of modernity, mining can still be dirty business. Australia has over 300 operating mines, producing 26 mineral commodities. On face value, it produces 9.5% of Australia's Scope 1 and 2 emissions, which are its direct emissions. It's a lot, but things get quite interesting when you look at the mining industry's indirect emissions. The ratio of iron ore we export compared to what we turn to steel was approximately 2 to 1 in the year 2000. In the year 2020, we exported 16 times more iron ore than we turned into steel at home. The dig it up and ship it out philosophy has meant that Australia exports more than 900 megatons of CO2 equivalent a year. This is more than 1.8 times the total domestic emissions of Australia. In short, we offshore our emissions. The electrification of mining and the introduction of cheap hydrogen could once again make it economically viable to produce large quantities of steel and aluminium in Australia. Not only would net zero green steel and aluminium attract a global premium, it would also dramatically reduce Australia's total emissions and could equate to one of the most profound and powerful sources of climate action this country is capable of producing. This is the environmental case for net zero mining, but there is a mounting economic and business case too. In Australia, we're moving from a soft law environment to a hard law environment, where the country's largest emitters will likely be required to reduce their emissions by 5% a year until we reach our climate goals in 2030 under Labor government's reforms to the safeguard mechanism. In short, a mining company's carbon footprint is fast becoming one of its largest liabilities. The days where large mining companies could emit carbon for free are over. It's also becoming cheaper and more viable to electrify harder to abate mining activities that used to rely on diesel. Mining companies already investing in large-scale solar and wind projects to feed directly into their mines and electrify autonomous trucks are being prototyped and tested by some of Australia's largest mining companies. Things will really take off if and when we crack the availability to produce green hydrogen and ammonia at scale, as these can be transported much like coal and gas from where they are produced to where they're needed, and have the ability to replace many of the high-intensity fossil fuel reliant mining process operations that have been historically hard to abate. There's also a strong case for green premiums that mining companies will be able to charge in the future for net zero products. This has already been recognised by companies like Bellevue Gold, which have set in place plans to go net zero by 2026, in anticipation that bullion and jewellery made with zero emissions will attract a higher premium. On the flip side of this, the EU announced that it would impose a carbon dioxide emissions tariff on imports and polluting goods such as steel and cement in a world-first scheme aimed to support European industries as they decarbonise. The final major reason for Australian mining companies to move towards net zero emissions is capital. PwC estimates that ESG-focused institutional investing will account for $33.9 trillion USD by 2026, which is approximately 21% of the total assets under management. The global energy transition is putting a focus on sustainable supply chains, and more so, if you want money to build new mines, they'll need to be carbon neutral.